Well, today we're talking about another plant that you can forage for, or forage from, I should say, and that's black cherry. Look at all the cherries. Time to harvest some black cherries. So this is a black cherry tree. They're native to eastern North America, and even though the light's kind of fading, you can see they're pretty good sized trees. In fact, they get a lot bigger than this individual. And those little berries up there are the part that you forage for, the black cherries. So black cherry is one of those plants that I think is probably more recently better known for its wood than it is for its cherries. To be 100% honest with you, up until this year, I don't think I've ever really come across too many black cherries that have been in full fruit. And probably that, coupled with the fact that this plant gets quite large, is sort of the big reason why nobody even thinks to go foraging for black cherries most of the time. So one of the things that's sort of maybe a little bit distinctive about black cherry is the leaves. They tend to be this kind of oblong shape, like what you can see here. They've got some minute serrations to the edge of them. They look very different than choke cherry, which tends to have rounder leaves. And black cherry gets a lot bigger. Basically, this is a full-size deciduous tree. It's a bit difficult to see here, but you can just make out some rusty or orangish colored hairs along the midrib. It's another thing to kind of look for. And although this is the wrong time of year, the buds are much smaller than choke cherry. The easiest way to sort of tell a larger individual of this species apart from kind of almost anything else, at least in the part of Ontario that we live in, is by the bark. Because once they get to this size or bigger, you'll start to get this bark effect that some describe as looking like cornflakes on the edges. You can kind of see it's like a whole bunch of little flakes of cornflakes. It's a very good way to describe it. And they're really, where we are, there aren't any other deciduous trees that you would come across, wild landscape or semi-wild landscape, that really has this look to it. The younger growth of black cherry has that sort of distinctive, I'm going to say it almost looks like young birch. Of course, it's not the same, it's not peeling quite like that, but it definitely has a very different look from the older bark. But you can see on this tree, as I scan down the trunk, the transition where it starts to go to that more familiar cornflake look. And this tree is a really good example of sort of how the little cherries look on the tree. They kind of are all on those little clusters that sort of hang down. It's actually quite pretty right now. This tree is just coming into sort of prime harvesting. You can see some of them are still quite red and haven't gone black yet, but those that have are really big and really juicy. Now there are other plants, other deciduous trees and bushes that have little black berries like this, and even choke cherry. The berries will turn quite a black color, but as I keep saying, choke cherry is a shrub, so it will max out, give or take, around sort of 10 to 15 feet, while these black cherries are full-on trees. It's nothing to say that you might come across a 60-foot plus tree. You can see these trees here in the fence row are pretty good sized trees, and those are all black cherries. If you look real close, you can actually see that there's quite a few cherries up there. So these plants are quite prolific when they want to be. Now, one thing that I've noticed in sort of my travels of Ontario is seldom do I come across a lot of black cherries that are loaded with fruit. My theory on that is this is a plant that tends to exist in a deciduous forest type setting. It does do quite well along the edges as well, but it can kind of compete right up there with things like sugar maple, etc. Now eventually, because when they're young, they don't tolerate the shade as well as the sugar maple, they will succumb to sort of being outcompeted. But a lot of the biggest trees you find are growing in a forest or woodland type setting. We have several trees like this one over here that are growing in a much more open setting. So this is part of our sheep pastures. Basically, there's not a lot of competition except for a few apples and the odd young ash tree. So these trees are laughing as far as conditions in this open grown sort of form that you're getting here really seems to promote fruit production. So that kind of brings up an interesting point about foraging, for me at least, is a lot of people I think foraging is just, well, I go for a walk in the woods and I come home with a plethora of edible goodies. And the reality of it is a lot of these species, a lot of these plant species that are most edible for us are still fighting basically for their own existence with a plethora of other species. Trees being no exception. I mean, what I just said about the sugar maples sort of eventually outcompeting the black cherries. And so one of the things here, and why I think this is interesting to show these open grown trees, is it really shows you that if you want to increase the likelihood of being able to get a fairly decent haul from a large number of species, this is not unique to black cherry, modifying the landscape, which is something humans do really well, can definitely be put to work to help your target species. So this is a black cherry tree, but one thing that's interesting about this particular species is they don't always ripen at the exact same time. So this particular tree is, if I had to guess, at least probably a week to maybe 2 weeks behind some of the ones that we've been harvesting off of lately. And it's very easy to see that these are not quite ripe. If I was to pick one, they're still a bit firm, and although they have lovely red cherry color, that's not what you're looking for from black cherry. Of course, what you're looking for from a black cherry tree is dark colored or black cherries, like these ones here. Now, one thing you'll notice, even though this year we have a plethora of cherries, like as I scroll up here, there's more cherries than we can harvest and more cherries than we can access. But you probably noticed there, a lot of those black cherries were missing, i.e. they've already been nabbed by the birds. That's not necessarily inherently a bad thing, because black cherry does provide a lot of valuable food for a vast number of species, many of which are songbirds, which of course do play quite an important role from an ecological perspective. So if you've got enough of these trees around, there's a pretty good chance, if they're happy and in a location where they're likely to be very productive, i.e. kind of open grown like this, you're likely to get a lot of cherries. So there's more than enough to go around. The downside is, though there's lots of cherries down low, and we do have a ladder to allow us to get a few more cherries, we are still limited on what we can reach. So as I go up here, this sort of half-grown cherry tree here is absolutely loaded at the top. Of course, the one negative to black cherry that really nobody can avoid talking about is they are a big tree. And that makes collecting the berries or the cherries a little more difficult than some of the more shrubby species. On top of that, the species is not as fast growing as some of the shrubby species. So if you don't already have some nearby, you might be waiting quite a while if you were to plant some of these to try to start to get a harvest. There we go for tonight. That's a pretty good sized bowl. We didn't quite fill it, but there's quite a few. We're going to come back tomorrow and try to get enough to make a full batch of syrup, because we basically need this bowl plus a little bit filled. But really, harvesting a lot of these cherries like this, although you are completely fine to eat some of them, you probably won't be able to eat most of them in a timely enough manner. So this is a great plant to use to make preserves, syrups, things that you can then store for later, i.e. can, because you don't get a long period of time when these cherries are available. So if you happen to live in an area that is within the native range of black cherry, I highly recommend you do some scouting. If you've got some on your property, you can always modify things so that the cherries are happier, and you won't be disappointed with the results, especially if they're open grown, where you might actually be able to reach some of the lower branches to get the cherries. So there you go, black cherry, one of those native plants that's exceptionally edible and not that difficult to collect. Didn't take us very long to get that bowl full. The downside is they get big, so you're only going to be able to collect what you can reach from the ground. And I think this is a good reminder again that nature can be very productive and provide a lot, but sometimes to make it a little easier for us, it needs a little bit of help, i.e. these open grown black cherries make a big difference compared to black cherries that you might find growing in a deciduous forest as far as actually getting some cherries off them. So on that note, we'll leave it there, but hopefully you enjoyed this. And if you haven't already, feel free to like, comment, and subscribe in typical YouTube fashion. And we'll catch you later.